This video continues our discussion of eukaryotic cells, and we will look at pages 6.3 and 6.4 in this video. So the next thing we'll talk about, our next couple of organelles we will talk about are mitochondria and chloroplasts, and these are really important organelles that deal with cell energy. So when we look at the way that eukaryotic cells function, there's all sorts of activity going on within the cell that you would have no idea actually occurs if you didn't learn about it, because it's not really obvious that there's all this stuff going on, but there's really just a tremendous amount of things going on within a cell, and they're very complex. Now, what this means, though, is that the cells need lots and lots of energy. So each member of the cell team, as we can refer to the group of organelles within a eukaryotic cell, requires a lot of energy in order to just carry out their basic functions. Now, there are really two organelles in eukaryotic cells that provide energy. There are two specific organelles that deal exclusively with controlling or providing and using energy, or taking energy and putting it or converting it into a usable form for the cell. These two organelles are the mitochondria and chloroplast. So we'll talk about mitochondria first, and then we'll talk about the little bit more specialized chloroplast. So mitochondria are the power source for eukaryotic cells. Now, mitochondria is actually the plural of the word mitochondrion, which refers to a single mitochondrion, or a single one of these organelles. So these, again, are membrane-bound organelles, which means we do not find them in prokaryotes. And they perform a process called cellular respiration, which is a process, essentially this is the last step in digesting your food. They take highly broken down food products and break them down one last time and transform the food and the energy that's stored within the food essentially into something called ATP energy. So all eukaryotic cells have mitochondria. This is a universal structure when it comes to eukaryotic cells. It occurs in all eukaryotic cells. And basically what they do is they turn crude oil, and this is a really good analogy. A really good analogy for the food that we eat is we could call it crude oil. Like if you go out on an oil rig or someone's drilling for oil, and you may have seen it in a movie or something like that, where you see this black oil that comes up when someone strikes oil. Well, that oil is what we call crude oil, and it is very crude. It's very impure. It's essentially very dirty, and it needs to be refined before it can be used for anything, any purpose. But it does contain a lot of energy. So the food we eat could be called crude oil. So our mitochondria, basically, they take this crude oil. Now, they don't work alone and do this. Our whole digestive system has broken things down tremendously before it gets to the mitochondria. But this is really the last step. So we have crude oil, which our food, which we call crude oil, and the mitochondria essentially take that food, which is a very crude form of energy, and they refine it in the very last step and turn it into gasoline, essentially, which is what we do with actual oil. And the gasoline of the cell is what we call ATP, or energy. ATP is a molecule, but it is the gasoline of our cells, and actually all living things use ATP as their primary energy source that's usable. If you took crude oil and put it in your gas tank, you would destroy your car. But that crude oil goes to an oil refinery and is broken down and ultimately is refined into gasoline. It's one of many, many products we get from crude oil. And that gasoline, then you can put that in your gas tank and run your car. It's a similar kind of thing. Raw food that we eat cannot be used directly by our body for energy. We have to refine it and break it down through multiple steps, the last of which is performed by the mitochondria. So they take that last bit of food that has stored energy in it and go through the last few chemical steps to break it down and release energy that is used to form this molecule called ATP that is the actual gasoline on which our body runs. So mitochondria are kind of interesting because they have their own DNA that is different from our DNA, our nuclear DNA. They have their own types of ribosomes, and they can divide themselves within a cell. So they're kind of interesting this way. And this sort of lends itself to the idea that mitochondria maybe used to be prokaryotic organisms that were incorporated into eukaryotic cells. And we won't get into that too much in this class. This molecule that I mentioned already a few times that they produce, ATP, and actually we have talked about ATP as one of, in our organic molecule chapter, we talked about ATP a little bit. It is a molecule that acts as the main energy source for cell processes in all living things, and it is a modified nucleotide that and we looked at the structure of ATP a little bit in our organic molecule chapter, but it is made on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So mitochondria will take the last our food that has been broken down multiple times into, we often use glucose, a glucose molecule, a simple sugar molecule, to represent the last bit of food that needs to be broken down and turned into this ATP. It's refined and into this ATP molecule that our body can actually use to perform any process that needs energy. Again, this process is called cellular respiration. This is a chemical process performed by the mitochondria, and it uses oxygen to break down food molecules and transforms their stored energy into ATP. This is also why we breathe, is to get this oxygen into our body so we can perform cellular respiration, and that occurs within the mitochondria. Okay, the next organelle we will talk about are the chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts, unlike mitochondria, do not occur in all eukaryotic cells. Chloroplasts are really exclusively organelles of plants and protists, some protists, particularly the algae type of protists. But the presence of chloroplast in some cells allows these cells to make their own food, and actually for the most part chloroplasts are what probably 99% of all living things depend on the chloroplast that occur within these types of organisms that we often refer to as producers, that is the plants and algae. So plant and algal cell organelle that performs photosynthesis by capturing light energy and converting it to chemical energy. So that's what the chloroplasts are. They are green in color, and there's a picture of one here to the right, and that's what gives plants and algae their green color. So it is only present in plant and algae cells. Now, like mitochondria, chloroplasts also have their own DNA and ribosomes and can divide within a cell, and they function essentially independently of the rest of the organelles within the cell, not governed by the nucleus or anything else. Now, the way that chloroplasts work, or the reason that they work, is because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll. Now, pigment is a term that is given to molecules that have a particular color to them. So chlorophyll is a pigment. It's on the inner membrane of chloroplast, and it is the molecule that captures light energy from sunlight that shines on the plant or the algae cell, and gives the plant or the algae their green color. So it is a green pigment. So chlorophyll gives plants their green color. Now, chlorophyll is found inside the inner membrane of chloroplast. Now, I didn't show this to you with mitochondria, but you should take a look. Both mitochondria and chloroplast have these complex internal structures, all these folded membranes. And in chloroplast, you have all these little discs that look like stacks of Smarties or Mentos or something like that, those candies. But anyway, photosynthesis is the process by which plants and algae will take sunlight and carbon dioxide and water, and they make sugar and oxygen. So they take carbon dioxide and water, these two simple chemicals, and with the energy that they absorb from sunlight, they're able to take these two low energy reactants and form high energy sugar and oxygen. So essentially they make food and oxygen, which is incredibly useful for us, and we are 100% dependent upon photosynthesis for life, basically. It provides both our food and our oxygen that we need. So photosynthesis occurs within the chloroplasts. All right, the next cell organelles we will talk about are lysosomes. And lysosomes are organelles that contain digestive enzymes. They're actually much like, they look like little vesicles essentially, but they're specialized because they contain digestive enzymes much like the chemicals that are in your stomach. So the function of lysosomes is to digest old organelles. Sometimes organelles get old and need to be replaced, and lysosomes help the cell to recycle the products or the structures that make up those organelles, the molecules that make up those organelles, to be reused. So they can digest old organelles. They digest food particles, and also invading bacteria and viruses. This is a very important immune system function. Lysosomes, a lot of our immune system cells, like our white blood cells, will attack invading viruses and bacteria and essentially eat them. And they bring them into the body of the cell, and then these lysosomes will go to work digesting these food products or these bacteria and viruses that have been taken into the cell. So lysosomes are found mainly in animal cells, but they are present in plant cells as well, so you should not think that they are not. And you can sort of compare lysosomes to floating stomachs. They're like floating stomachs, and over here on the right you can see a process or lysosome participating in this digestive process for some food that's taken into a cell. Lots of protists, like the amoebas, for example, that are predatory. They eat other protists. They digest these things by the action of these lysosomes. Prey will be brought into the body, and a lysosome will fuse with a food vacuole that holds that prey and then digest it within the body of the amoeba. All right, so I just mentioned a word, vacuole, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is the next organelle we will look at. Vacuoles are membrane-bound compartments, and membrane-bound like all these other organelles that we have talked about in this unit. They're in a cell, and they're used for temporary storage of materials or waste. Animal cells usually do not have vacuoles, although they will have food vacuoles, but they don't have the larger vacuoles that we'll talk about. Some vacuoles in plant and fungal cells act much like lysosomes, so they will have a sort of digestive function as well. Now there is one specific specialized type of vacuole we will talk about, and that is a central vacuole. This is a very large vacuole that occurs in plant cells, and you can see it over here on the picture to the right. It's labeled there, and this is actually, most of the time in eukaryotic cells, especially in animal cells, the largest organelle in the cell is the nucleus. Well, in plant cells, oftentimes the largest organelle is actually this central vacuole, and it's a big internal water tank, basically. Each cell in a plant has its own internal water storage system, and that is because plants, unlike animals, when plants get thirsty, they just have to sit there and wait for it to rain. If an animal's thirsty, it can go out hunting or seeking water somewhere. If you're thirsty, you can get up and go to the water fountain. But plants are unable to do this, so they have a water storage system that allows them to deal with periods of drought and not die. They have their own, each cell in the plant has their own water storage system, and if there is a drought, they will slowly use the water in the central vacuole, and then as soon as it rains or they are supplied with water, they immediately will fill back up the central vacuole to deal with the next period of drought, to prepare for the next period of drought. So in some plant cells, the central vacuole makes up 90% of the total volume of the cell. It is, like I said, it is often the largest organelle inside of a plant cell. Okay, next we'll talk about cytoskeleton, which is a little bit abstract, a little bit harder to understand maybe than some of the other organelles. Organelles within a cell do not float around in a sea of cytoplasm. There's actually all these, essentially this web of proteins that goes all through the cytoplasm of a cell and holds most of the organelles in place. And that is what the cytoskeleton does. So the cell and its organelles have a complex support structure that's called the cytoplasm. You can think of the cytoplasm kind of like the poles of a tent. If you took all the poles out of a tent, the tent would collapse. Well, a cell is kind of similar in that it is held up and held in place and held together by all of these poles of cytoplasm, essentially. Now it's like a web of cytoplasm, and they're made from a couple of different types of proteins. They hold the cell together, hold organelles in place, but they also provide tracks on which some of the organelles move around, like the vesicles and food vacuoles and lysosomes, and actually chloroplasts as well, often will move around inside of a cell, but they're not just floating randomly. They're actually moving around on tracks, like trains on a track. And these tracks are made from this cytoskeleton. So cytoskeleton is the support structure for the cell. It's made up of a web of proteins. It helps to maintain the shape of the cell in the same way that the poles of a tent maintain the shape of the tent, like I just said. But they also provide a sort of a highway system on which organelles can move throughout the cell, because, like I said, some organelles, like vesicles and food vacuoles and lysosomes and chloroplast, actually do move around throughout a cell. All right, so this table down here, table number 1, has a breakdown of some of the organelles we've talked about here. The nucleus, ribosomes, actually ribosomes we didn't talk about in this unit, but we did talk about them in the previous unit, Unit 5, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, chloroplast, Golgi complex, vacuole, and lysosomes. And the picture here on the left, lower left, shows an image where the protein fibers that make up the cytoskeleton have been enhanced. You can see this right here is the outline of one cell, and what you see are all these little fibers going all over the place, all through the cell. And those are the protein fibers that make up the cytoskeleton.